Good afternoon. My name is Robert Walker, and I'm Brand Manager for retirementhomes.com. Welcome to our May webinar. We are North America's leading online sales and marketing solutions provider, including our housing directory, our online library, and e-newsletters. We also offer, free of charge to senior living communities, the top experts in senior living every month who will share their knowledge in the fields of marketing, research, sales, and related areas in webinars such as the one you're about to hear. This month, we welcome Janis Ehlers of the Ehlers Group of Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Janis's presentation, How Senior Living Communities Can Use Good PR to Drive More Move-ins, will teach the basics of public relations techniques and practical tips for senior living professionals. There will be a question and answer session at the end of the presentation. If you would like a question answered, raise your hand in the toolbar to the right, type in your question, and time permitting, it will be answered at the end of the presentation. And of course, you are also welcome to ask a question anytime during the session itself. Please welcome Janis.
Robert, thank you so much. I'd like to first thank retirementhomes.com for the invitation to speak today. Public relations is my passion, and despite my years in the business, I still feel so much excitement when we've achieved positive press on behalf of one of our clients. Seeing their name in print really validates our efforts. So first, I think it's important to define public relations because often the term public relations is used interchangeably with press relations and press releases. So really, public relations influences people's behavior and motivation. And I think we can simplify it by thinking about the last car you either bought or leased. It wasn't exactly a totally spontaneous decision. There were motivations in that decision, such as your own research, reading about it, talking to your neighbors and coworkers, seeing it driven by a movie star in a movie, picking up something that mentioned that car's name. So something motivated that behavior, including your experiences on the showroom floor. Part of your decision was affected by a public relations effort. Public relations is a third-party endorsement. It's an unpaid endorsement versus paid advertising, and I'll explain that a little bit more. But it requires dealing with who your audiences are and deciding what you want them to do. In the case of senior communities, we want people to move to our community, but you can't tell them to move there. You need to influence them in making this decision. I always laugh when someone says, we just need some good PR. And it's like you can open up a can and it just pops out. But it's much more complicated than that. Public relations is so effective. People believe what they read. Will Rogers years ago said, all I know is what I read in a newspaper. An article in a newspaper has a 70% greater retention rate than an ad. So think about what your advertising costs, what your advertising budget is. One ad may have motivated you to go to the automobile showroom that day, and maybe it was the Saturday that you were looking in the car section of the paper, but that dealership had to advertise many Saturdays to reach all the potential buyers, and what they are spending is thousands and thousands of dollars. On any one Sunday, you'll see more than one senior community advertising. But will all of those ads motivate the telephone to ring? So as I mentioned, an article in the newspaper is a third-party endorsement. Someone else tells your story. One article can be remembered for years. It's also not the length of the article that matters. It's that your community's name is mentioned in a positive light. If you and your community are mentioned in a larger article, you may be associated with other communities and leaders in the industry. So even that's effective. I always say people do business with people they know, people they hear about, people they read about. So one article may be read not only by a potential customer, a customer's family, residents, residents' families, employees, employees' families, referral sources. So the list goes on and on. And the greatest compliment is when someone says, I read about you in the newspaper. I remember a resident at one of our communities was featured in an article about her participating in the community's Summer Olympic Challenge. She said when she went to the doctor's office, they made her feel like a celebrity because they had read about her in the newspaper. They will remember that article for years. And guess what? Public relations and getting your name in the newspaper is free. The article that mentions your community didn't cost a dime, or the time that it took for the TV news to come and cover an event. That was free publicity too. Now, although there's many positives, there are some disadvantages. Public relations efforts can't be controlled. It's not on your terms or your timetable. It's much harder today. There are fewer reporters, and certainly if you pick up your daily newspaper, you'll see that the newspaper is much thinner. So it takes time to produce the results, and as well as the benefits. There's no guarantee. Just because you want the coverage and think you have a great story, and you may well have a good story, there's no guarantee that no matter how strong that story is, a reporter will cover it. That day, when you're having your wonderful event, there could be something far more monumental that the reporters will be covering, and your story will be pushed by the wayside. It didn't mean that you didn't have a great event. It's just that there were conflicts. And I could entertain somebody for years with those kind of stories. It's also difficult in terms to measure with regards to sales. And I know there are some budgets where someone says, we need to understand how to equate this back to sales. An article in the paper may not make that phone ring today. So it's difficult to say that a specific number of traffic units were generated by PR. Although I have seen in some cases someone walk into the sales office and put down a deposit from an article they read. That article motivated them to come to the sales office. Someone on your team needs to be allocated to pursue public relations. They need to be skilled at asking someone to write about your community. They need to be able to determine if the story deserves coverage or how to angle it so it's more interesting to a reporter. And that's an investment because it involves somebody. It's an investment of time and money. You're putting your future in someone else's hands. It may not come out exactly the story that you wanted. And I guess the bottom line is, if you want guarantees that something will appear in the newspaper, it's better to buy an ad. Advertising doesn't necessarily guarantee publicity, although there are some newspapers, and these are called advertorials, where you can pay for what looks like an article when it's really an advertorial. And we'll talk a little bit more about that too. Public relations, to be effective, should be combined with other strategies. It's only one aspect of branding. And now when you're able to combine public relations with social media, it is that much more valuable. It takes time to build a brand. Public relations is only one component of brand building. But public relations, to really be effective, needs to work with advertising, special events, direct mail, customer service, and customer relationships. If you have a less than glowing reputation, or someone has purchased a failed community, there's a new owner, and you're trying to turn that community around, that takes time to undo. One article isn't going to turn the negatives around. And so it's important to be realistic as to what public relations will accomplish. So how do you get buzz techniques going? Well, just like any other marketing program, it needs a strategy. You need to get people talking, so you need to determine what you want to accomplish and how you will go about developing those goals. It's important to be realistic. An executive director may say, oh, I want the New York Times, or a public relations professional may promise the New York Times or USA Today or the Wall Street Journal. But in reality, although this sounds great, they may not be able to deliver this lofty media coverage. Ultimately, you really want people to speak well of your community, visit, and recommend. That's one of the goals. So localized strategies in getting the local newspaper to write about your community may be much more effective. On the other hand, there are times that national media and buzz can go from local to national and just balloon. Years ago, we were working with a community, and there was a movie about ladies who bared it all for a calendar. I think the movie was called Calendar Girls or something like that. And one of our communities had a group of men that decided that they wanted to bear it all and do their own calendar. Well, talk about buzz. The activity director put together a pretty simple calendar. She had it printed at Office Depot. It was distributed to residents, and it was sent to the local newspaper. Well, I'm telling you, this took off like wildfire. CNN and NBC were at the community along with the local news. So something like that, I can't tell you yes or no, but it's just amazing because it was so creative and it tied into something of a bigger nature. So in determining your messages, I think it's worthwhile to go back to a recent SWOT analysis that perhaps your marketing team or your entire team conducted. These are the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats that you brainstormed. And in thinking about your strengths and weaknesses, this can also be turned around into positive PR messages. So that's how you really strategize your messages to the media. For example, we work with an older CCRC, and while some may see an aging campus, we found that they were conducting some very innovative recycling efforts. And so this older community had a great PR hook that showed the community to be innovative. It's also important to think how you will market your news coverage. Today's newspaper wraps your garbage tonight. So when you've worked so hard to get your community's name publicized and it's on the cover of the local section, you need to think about how you will maximize that exposure, and I'll give some tips on that in a few minutes. It's important that news trickle out. Various stories are distributed to the media and not just one. I sort of compare that to a water faucet. You just want that trickle. You want your community's name coming across reporters' desks once a month, once every 2 months. I always call it having a nose for news. You need to think about what would be of interest. What would you like to read in the newspaper? And ask yourself, is this worthy of being in the newspaper? So in a marketing meeting, when somebody says, let's get a reporter to cover this, you have to think about if it really is press worthy. Will it be visually interesting? And what will a camera see? And does it warrant being photographed? A client called us and told us they were having an intergenerational prom. Now, I envisioned this wrongly as a prom with corsages and the kids dressed up and an archway with balloons. And she said, oh, this was going to be fantastic, that we should really try to get the media there. So we sent a professional photographer to cover the event, and we did a pitch to the media that this was an intergenerational prom. when I saw the pictures, and I also learned that the media did not come out, I was really grateful because it was an intergenerational event and the teens were sitting around talking with the seniors, but there weren't any corsages, there wasn't really any visual, and it really wasn't a prom. So it's really important to understand if you're going out to the media, what will be the strong visual and what will make it unique and different and have a different angle. There are ways that you can separate your community from others, and I think the recycling example that I gave was good. But then there's also potential of seeing what is similar with your community to others. And you could pitch an article about what your community is doing that is typical to senior housing. For example, thrift stores. Several communities in your area may have a thrift store that is manned by residents and open one day a week to the general public. So when you go out and approach the media on the fact that your community has a thrift store, citing that this is more typical and these are several different communities that have them, may get your thrift store article in the newspaper. You need to determine the right reporters and the media. There are many resources where you can take a story. So most important, it's critical that you read your local newspaper, watch your local news, and to the radio, like your NPR and your other talk stations. In a local newspaper, you have different sections. You have business, and that would be a business angle. Real estate, unless this is a brand new community and there's a real estate transaction, generally senior communities are not real estate. The real estate section is for new home communities and are often advertising sections. Your local news, that gives you a cover, and there's opportunities there. There's another section of your paper, depending on the area of the country. Sometimes they're called the living section or the lifestyle section, but that's where you have a lot of your features. That's where you have your food section. Your sports, in some communities, there may be opportunities in the sports section. There are also your columnists and bloggers and online editions of the newspaper. Then there's also, in some areas, what we call a metropolitan paper. And those metropolitan papers have local sections. So in South Florida, for example, the Miami Herald covers into other counties besides Miami-Dade County. The Sun Sentinel and the Palm Beach Post do as well. Another example would be the Washington Post. Not only does the Washington Post cover Washington, but it also would cover Virginia and Maryland. So these are your metropolitans. Then you have local TV and radio. You have weekly community newspapers, and those are great because many times those are free publications. They're distributed around a town, and there's great community news in those. Your business newspapers, those are generally weekly or monthly and maybe geared to business. You have industry trade publications, industry newsletters, and now there's social media bloggers. So opportunities for publicity. I find it's easier to divide the public relations opportunities into three different topics. You have community-oriented news, you have corporate company news, and you have crisis-related issues. In community news, you're bringing attention to the community in a positive light. And it's really worthwhile to brainstorm with your staff on different things that are going on. People may know interesting residents and upcoming events. Activity directors are great resources. I just think, here's a tip, they may be very sensitive when they learn that their event is great for residents and it makes residents happy, but it doesn't have a strong news hook. On the other hand, they may be having an event that can be pumped up a little that makes it more newsworthy. For example, if they're having a resident art show, if they focus on the art that the residents created while living at the community, now, and perhaps there's a 90-year-old who discovered painting while living at the community, now that art show becomes much more newsworthy. There's milestones and events, there's residents of interest, there's residents who are making contributions to the external community, the cities where they live, and there's just a wealth of opportunity by piggybacking on national events and holidays. There's opportunities with your best practices, for example, your maintenance or your recycling or employment issues. There's strong hooks when you involve children and pets. And it's always worthwhile to have some ambassadors who you target who will be able to be available to the media and who would be your good spokespeople, so that you aren't scrambling if a reporter calls and wants some quotes, that you aren't scrambling to find somebody. So here are a few ideas over the years that we've developed. This is small, but community decided to install a new flagpole, and it was made into a celebration with Boy Scouts and Color Guard, and that got on the TV. A tree planting, grounds improvement, butterfly gardens, inviting local scouts and school children make that newsworthy. A 50th anniversary, if it's an event, that can be turned into news. Student scholarships that residents are raising money for employees, that's great. For example, National Senior Health and Fitness Day is next week, May 29th. That could have been a great celebration in May. Grandparents' Day is in September. If you do something different, that could make that newsworthy. June is National Rose Month, and it goes on and on. July is National Hot Dog Month, Martin Luther King Day. So there's just a host of things. You always want to think about what your community is doing different. You could be doing pet therapy. There could be different exercise classes. One community was holding a step and cane exercise class, and the residents were just loving this. When we pitched that to a reporter, the reporter said, well, if they didn't live in that community, where would they go for a similar class? So that showed me that if you're pitching, you need to think about how that would be applicable to the external community and where somebody could go for those resources. If it's a new class being offered, make sure that the kinks are ironed out and the classes are underway. You want some residents who could talk about their experiences. Foreign visitor tours. We've gotten some great press on people who have come from Sweden and China to tour and then also talk to the press about their views on senior housing. Reporters love children and pets, so whenever you can tie these things together, it's great. But be sure the children can be photographed. Events are always easy to publicize, especially when they're open to the public. So always ask yourself, would this be interesting in tomorrow's newspaper? Can I see somebody having a cup of coffee and reading this article? Seek inspiring subjects, people who are still making contributions. We found a couple who volunteer at a local zoo 365 days a year. We got them so much publicity. Seniors who are authoring books are really interesting. And group projects and donations. Ladies knitting scarves for Hurricane Sandy victims. And unfortunately, this recent tornado in Oklahoma, you could do some fundraising for that. 100-year-old people with celebrating birthdays, you really have to think about that, because you need to think if this is the image you want to project, and is this person inspirational? Learn about the family. See if the person can speak to a reporter, tie the birthday to events of the past. Is the family coming to town to celebrate? Is there something unusual about the family? So it really is more than just going to the media and saying, Mrs. Jones is celebrating her 100th birthday. Now, in company and corporate public relations, That's the business side. And that could cover things like personnel announcements, an acquisition, renovation, expansion of the community, new communities, contracts with various subcontractors, personnel profiles. In the Miami Herald, we have a reporter that writes in a column called Balancing Act, and she's always interested in people who are balancing work and family. Also, career spotlights. We find chefs that cook in senior housing, make good stories. We can usually get them covered in the business side rather than the food section. So, because their job allows them more flexible time than most chefs. There's also on the move columns where people who are spotlighted who have been promoted or moved to a new job or started a new career. There's the financial success in the senior housing business. Senior housing provides a lot of jobs and also stability, so you could pitch a story on that. There's awards and recognition your community receives. Even as something as small as speaking appearances that someone at the community is making, or attendance at a convention for the industry. Whenever possible, offer a reporter additional resources and help them do their homework for a story. We aren't really going to talk about crisis public relations today. All I really would like to leave you with is to say you need to be prepared for bad news situations too. So now we're going to talk about, and I've referenced this concept of a pitch versus a press release. What you're really trying to do is interest the media. If they write the article, it's a pitch. If you provide a press release, they could use the entire article, or they extract and write their own from the information you provide. If you're writing a press release, you want to use what we call an inverted pyramid, that the information is in the beginning in what we call the lead of the article. And it's very factual. You quote a person. It does not have a lot of fluff. It doesn't have a lot of adjectives about how superlative, how wonderful, how extraordinary. It just says what the facts are. And it's good to attach a photograph with a press release. If you aren't an expert writer, don't despair. You can use the internet and that you can find press release writers, but also you could pitch and present a media inquiry to a specific reporter. In this, you're providing relevant information, and you're giving them the tools to be able to write the story on their own. You need to tell them why in a way that this would interest readers. So it would be typical for you either to email or telephone and say, here's an idea I think might be of interest because I read an article that you recently wrote about, and tie it together. So an example might be pitch specific residents to a local reporter tied to national elections if the reporter is interested in senior opinions, and for example, if your community is a polling place. Pitch an event that your community is doing that's earlier than someone else. So for example, celebrating New Year's Eve at noon might appeal to a reporter who wants to get their New Year's Eve story written earlier. They can cover your event and still be able to celebrate New Year's Eve on their own. So don't miss an opportunity also to participate in a larger story. Look for a trend and try to get in on it. So for example, today's newspaper had an article about rental communities allowing pets. I'm going to use that as a perfect opportunity to pitch a writer about senior communities and how so many of them have pets and what they do to accommodate people. We always say press begets press. Sometimes people think a paper is too small. Disappointed if a press release or quote was boiled down to 3 lines. But journalists follow other journalists. So don't think that just those 3 lines aren't of value. Advertorials, this is where you are buying the space, but it's an article. and it could have the sales manager's name, the executive director's name, and either you write this or the newspaper might help you write it. National trade media, these are the industry trade publications. And although your customers aren't reading this, this gives you the huge credibility, and then it's worth merchandising after the fact. Now, you'll often hear people say that you need a press kit, and that can be pretty intimidating because you think that's real expensive. But press kits really just pull together the information, so if somebody's going to do an article, you can give them your press kit, and that gives them sort of all the background they need. So what would you find in a press kit? You'd find the background materials about your management team, a community fact sheet that would give the size of the community, the mix of units, the age, founders, the history, and this would be different than your marketing brochure. You'd provide photography, and it's also helpful to give an ALF glossary of terms because while we understand this industry, a reporter may not. If you have a policy on residents' privacy, it would be good to have that in there, recent press releases, and some industry background. Every community needs a spokesperson. This is the designated person who would talk to reporters. They need to be comfortable talking to the media, and they need to be available. And whether it's good news or bad news, it's so important to respond to a reporter's inquiry. Now, if you're getting the questions and a reporter has called you and yet you still need to go to the company or the community spokesperson, it's perfectly okay to say, what type of questions would you be asking? I just need to get a feel so that we can be prepared for that interview. On the other hand, as far as interview etiquette, you can't ask to see the story before it's printed. And be sure to say thank you. And also, you need to build a relationship with a reporter first. You can't just approach them and say, will you do a story about us? But on the other hand, it's really worthwhile to build a relationship with people and then later become their expert. In becoming an expert, you need to make yourself available on various, and let a reporter know various topics that you would be comfortable speaking about. Look for local radio talk shows to be on as an interviewee, even if these are internet radio shows. Get to know other people handling publicity, such as your Chamber of Commerce or the local Home Builders Association. A reporter may go to them and ask them for resources, and it would be good if they know your name. Send emails to various reporters complimenting their work. Let them know you're enjoying their articles. They get to take that to their boss, and they really appreciate the recognition. Social media today and public relations has become so valuable. And we often hear people say, oh, our residents aren't on Facebook, and that may well be true. But not only are their children their grandchildren, referral sources. So a community could have over 100,000 followers in a very short time. It's important that somebody be designated who is really adept at writing and understands how to write compelling content and has a strategy. Mrs. Jones is celebrating a birthday today is not compelling content. So that's what happens when people who are not really gifted with Facebook are starting to do posts versus somebody that understands the marketing strategy behind it. Using photos with Facebook is so important. And blogs, here again, you post regularly, you write compelling copy, you offer information that is helpful and insightful, and it's a terrific vehicle that keeps your website fresh and updated. There's many, I'm sure you've heard social media lectures about keeping your website fresh, and your blogs and Facebook really help that search engine optimization. We use blogs for press releases. So even if the news isn't using something, we put press releases in the blog in the newsroom, and we also use it for interesting material that might be press-worthy, but because there just aren't enough papers out there, we didn't get pickup on it, but it's still really worthwhile. Events and public relations. Well, I love opportunities for parties, and these really are worthwhile in getting your community in the paper. If it's open to the public, it's much easier. And so I divide events into pre-event publicity and post-event. Pre-event would be getting something in community calendars, an article about the event, and if it's really strong and you're really trying to get a lot of people there, you might try a public service announcement, although those are rarely, those are very difficult to get. Post-event, you want to do a recap of the event with a lot of pictures, or you want to have a reporter cover the event and write the article themselves. Here's another tip. We're finding, because it's so difficult to get people's permission after the fact, that when they come to the event and they're getting their name tag, have guests sign a photo release permission when they come. And then also, I really recommend, I know there is an expense of probably around $300 to get a professional photographer to take pictures and get photo IDs. Inevitably, the person who says they'll take the pictures gets wrapped up doing something else, the event's over, and you really don't have any pictures. Some examples of some events that have gotten coverage: identity theft, a community renovation to show it off after the fact, a fashion show that raised money for a local charity. New community public relations. A new community gives you entirely different opportunities than an existing community. So, but here again, you're keeping that trickle going, and it could be everything from announcing the community's launch to different consultants, to your staff, to your sales center opening, to your models. So there's just so many opportunities with a new community. But that's not to say existing communities don't provide a wealth as well. And this could be your event we discussed. We talked about newsworthy residents. There's also letters to the editors. So there's just so many things that your community can be shown in a positive light. Here are some PR successes. Valentine's Day vow renewals and community service projects with residents. And we mentioned the scholarships to employees. Even something like a new generator or new equipment or a new food vendor and a food tasting. So that is just so useful. Some PR challenges. In my career, I certainly have had a wealth of these. We've had opportunities where the community wanted somebody to talk to the media was interested, and then the resident wasn't cooperative. We were asked to cover an outing to a local restaurant, not really a very strong hook. We've had interesting speakers for an event, but we were told that there really wasn't a photo opportunity because it would be backs of heads. A repetitious event that you do every year, it got coverage one year, but it's not going to maybe get coverage every year, even though it's a great event. So we talked about the intergenerational prom. Good stories, residents won't talk to reporters. The community chef, unfortunately, in our area, in your major metropolitan areas, because these restaurants are not open to the public, sometimes it's difficult to publicize your restaurant. On the other hand, you might be able to get an article about the chef. Also, reporters may feel the community is too exclusive and only for the rich. So that's a challenge, too, that you have to work on. Once you get the PR, as I mentioned, it wraps the garbage. So you really need to take advantage of tooting your horn. And whether it's reprints that you're sending to articles, you're sending articles to residents, you're putting it in the database, you're using it as a handout, you're putting it on the website, you're posting it to Facebook. It's just, there are so many ways that you can maximize PR. And even a press release is valuable as a handout to residents, even if it doesn't appear in the newspaper. So whether you are using a public relations firm or you're doing it in-house, you set it up as a press release, and you do it as a handout to your customers. There needs to be procedures to handle press inquiries and establish a chain of command when the media would come to cover an event. So who would speak, who's going to relay those inquiries. Get photo releases of all residents when they sign your lease, so then you don't have to worry about it after the fact. And maintain a log of press inquiries so that you can track and follow up. You can ask if the reporter knows when the story will be used, but many times they don't actually know when it will appear. So there's no harm in asking, but be prepared to be told that. Another tips of the trade that we've learned over the years, if your community is, include the media so that someone can call the media and get feedback if they know about your community and what they know. Know your local papers and reporters. Keep the reporters on your invitation list so that you're inviting them to events. Understand their needs and deadlines, and if you're calling, always ask if this is a good time. Be accurate in anything that you give the media. Check spelling, check your facts. Keep your press releases and pitches simple and to the point. Be sure to say thank you. Attend events and try to find the reporters to introduce yourself. They're usually in the back of the room or the front of the room. They have notebooks and the lanyards, and it's okay to introduce yourself. When you're talking to the media, strive for simplicity. Terms like ADLs, CCRCs, ALFs, these are people that they don't really understand those terms. So take care when you're talking to somebody. Follow reporters. Send notes, like we mentioned. Pay them compliments. And some press don'ts. Unfortunately, you can't go to their office. Years ago, you could walk into a newsroom, and today you just can't. So you can email, you can telephone. Don't think that advertising will buy PR. So if you say to a reporter, well, we're putting a full-page ad in Sunday's paper, it's not going to get you PR. These are two different departments. Think of it as two separate floors in a building, and they don't go hand in hand. Don't exaggerate. It may work well in sales, but not with a reporter. So terms like luxury, unique, unless you really are, I wouldn't recommend using that. Don't ask to read their article in advance of publication. They aren't going to let you. And if you're misquoted, you aren't a celebrity. You got to live with it. So retractions are for very important people. And off the record really isn't off the record. It's really on the record. So you might hear that on TV, but it's just not done anymore. Agencies and consultants. Since I'm a consultant, I thought this might be of importance because I also was an in-house person. And regardless, the person needs to justify their existence. At an agency, you aren't their only account. They're working with other people. And there's a principal often in an agency, and then there's an account executive. But agencies have press contacts, and they're comfortable pitching and being rejected because they're doing that all the time. They should be able to meet with you and your team and be able to brainstorm. Not all of their ideas are doable, but they're a fresh set of eyes, and they look at it many times like a reporter would. Senior housing is unique. having somebody that understands what senior housing is and the differences between IL, ALF, skilled nursing, and CCRCs is helpful. It's important to be realistic. They may not be able to get you the coverage you want. It takes time, but they just need to be able to show you that they're trying on your behalf. An in-house person with a PR background is great too. And the only challenge of that is that sometimes they get split between two different things. So they may not just be doing the public relations and the social media, and then all of a sudden they have more things on their plate and they aren't able to devote the time they needed. So to wrap this up, in conclusion, I think these tips can give you a good idea of what public relations is. Last week, we had a client email us, and an article that we provided to the newspaper was actually printed in the newspaper. So we accomplished what we needed to do. They received a deposit from this article. So it just shows how powerful public relations is. So, Robert, I want to thank retirementhomes.com again. I also wanted to mention that I'm the author of the book Marketing Senior Housing, and that's available either through our office or on Amazon or through Author House. So that also has a chapter about public relations. And I look forward to answering any questions and comments that people have today.
Yes, thank you again, Janice. We have a couple questions here right now. We have a question about basically, you've heard the adage, is any publicity good publicity, and how to deal with, bad publicity at a community. What should the guidelines be with dealing with the media?
Oh, that's a good question and a tough question. And I would certainly need more specifics on how bad the publicity was. So, I just can't arbitrarily say that bad publicity would be good. People do remember what they read. So there would really need to be a strategy behind how to turn that around. And it just wouldn't be one thing. Like, we had a situation where someone called, and I think there was a murder at a building next door to this community, and that community was associated with the murder of someone, even though it wasn't at the community. So that would fall into crisis public relations, and there would need to be some things promoting the community that were positive, that were bringing positive attention to the community.
Okay. Now, a related question is that in terms of garnering controversy, would that be a good way to, to gain some exposure and visibility for communities, or you would recommend just staying away from that?
I would recommend staying away from it, because ultimately we're trying to, in my mind, affect a positive outcome with sales. So what will be gained from fueling the fire? I've worked on, and here again it goes back to crisis public relations and not community or company positive stories. But I've worked on things from picketers, fires, employee, an employee was murdered in the parking lot, as I said, wanderers. We've really tackled some very sensitive press issues. And sometimes it's just better to let these things go their course. Make a statement, but then just let it go, because the press likes to fuel the fire and go back and forth. So crisis public relations, as I started in my talk today, is very, very sensitive. And I really don't embrace the controversies unless you really have to.
Okay, and we have one final question now. Now, you addressed some of the potential dangers and things to avoid. What would you say are the top do-nots for public relations novices?
Well, I mentioned I think it's so important to really see if that story is worthwhile. And as I said, you just don't want to keep going to the media with weak things. And it's really good to pick up the telephone and to make that call and to see if that person was interested. I'll give you a perfect example. We were having an appraisal fair at a community, and we were bringing in a nationally renowned appraiser. And I really thought that this was press-worthy. Now, and it was sort of an antique roadshow situation. When I spoke to the writer at the paper, she said, unfortunately, she pointed out it wouldn't be a strong visual because it would be backs of heads. And, if you really wanted something on antiques, it would be an antique, you see the antique roadshow. So it really wasn't that unique. It was very nice, and it was a very successful event, but it just didn't warrant. We got good pre-press on it, but we didn't get the press coverage that we would have liked. On the other hand, we used the online newspaper edition, so we posted event photos. We were in Facebook. We were on the company blog. So we were able to take that event that didn't get coverage that day, and still do something really interesting with it. Now, if we had known in advance of something that was very, very rare, very unusual, then we might have gotten some coverage on it.
Okay, we actually had just two more questions that's come to us right now. What do you do if a reporter gets your information completely wrong? This person had a correspondence with a reporter, and they printed the wrong fees as well as population stats for the communities, even after being corrected. How should a community deal with that?
I would email and bring it to their attention, say thank you very much for the coverage. I just wanted to let you know this was an error, but here again, thank you for covering, and I hope you'll think of us the next time you need an article. Like I said, they aren't going to do a retraction, and they're making deadlines, and these things happen.
Okay, and we just have time for one more question. Once an online presence has been established, such as Facebook, how does a senior housing organization deal with posting by a former resident who has negative experiences or says they have negative experiences?
This is a great audience because they ask really good questions. With social media, yes, the administrator has the ability to delete, but in some ways, then that could fuel more problems. So the administrator has to be able to control some of those things. It's good. We have seen where we have had some negative comments brought to our attention, but it also gave us the opportunity to rectify those situations and make amends. So maybe if that former resident is venting, they need, and this would be an individual situation, they need to be approached more one-on-one or use, like we do exit interviews, soliciting residents' feedback on their experience at a community. So maybe a third party needs to have this person vent to them. Maybe some of the things they're saying are constructive. But, to just take it off creates problems. To leave it on, it may run its course and just let it go.
Okay. Perfect.
It just has to be assessed on an individual basis.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you very much, Janice. That's all the time for the questions we have today. Of course, you can certainly ask Janice or myself questions, follow up. All the information is there on the screen. Again, that was Janice Ehlers of the Ehlers Group. This presentation will be available on our website, retirementhomes.com, and at youtube.com/retirementhomes. Once again, check retirementhomes.com for information on our upcoming monthly webinars, or contact me at Robert at Retirement Homes for all details.